Three Cherokee children stood barefoot in the Oklahoma dust, their hollow eyes fixed on the stranger who never spoke. The youngest, barely 6, clutched a corn-husk doll with trembling fingers as her stomach growled loud enough to shame the crows. Behind them, the Blackwood farm stretched like a graveyard of dreams, its fields cracked and barren, its fences fallen, its very soil seeming to reject every seed that touched it. The silent cowboy, Marcus Stone, pulled his hat lower over eyes that had seen too much. Dust devils danced across the wasteland that locals whispered was cursed, carrying with them the echoes of broken promises and buried sorrows. The year was 1887, and the Cherokee Nation was learning that survival meant more than just enduring it, meant finding hope in the most unlikely places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Oklahoma Territory stretched endlessly under a sky the color of old brass, its vastness broken only by the occasional mesa rising like ancient monuments to forgotten gods. The land here held secrets in its red clay, secrets that most white settlers preferred to ignore, but which the Cherokee knew better than the lines on their own palms. Marcus Stone had been riding this territory for 3 weeks now, his horse's hooves marking time against earth that seemed to resist every footfall. He was a man carved from silence and shadow, 32 years old, but bearing the weathered face of someone who had lived twice that long. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, often mistaken for Cherokee blood by those who didn't look close. Enough to see the Irish green of his eyes. The truth was simpler and more complex than blood. Marcus Stone had chosen silence the day his voice failed to save the only people who ever mattered to him. Now he spoke only when words could change death into life, and those moments came rarer than rain in August. His horse, a sturdy paint named Crow, picked her way carefully along what had once been a proper road. The path was little more than wagon, ruts now, overgrown with sage and punctured by prairie dog holes. But it led where Marcus needed to go, toward the piece of land that a desperate banker in Tulsa had all but begged him to take. "The Blackwood farm," the banker had stammered, mopping sweat from his brow despite the autumn chill. 160 acres of prime farming soil. Well, it was prime once. Good cabin, sound barn, creek runs right through the middle of it. Marcus had waited knowing there was more. "Thing is," the banker continued, "previous owners, well, they didn't have much luck. Crops failed, livestock died off, that sort of thing. Folks around here got some notions about the place. Superstitious nonsense, you understand, but it's keeping buyers away." The banker had quoted a price so low it was practically theft. Marcus had nodded once and put down cash, ignoring the relief that flooded the man's face like sunrise after a long night. Now, 3 days later, he crested a low hill and saw his new property spread before him. Even from a distance, the wrongness was unmistakable. Where neighboring farms showed the golden stubble of harvested wheat or the rich brown of turned earth ready for winter, the Blackwood farm lay bare and gray. The soil looked poisoned, cracked into geometric patterns that hurt the eye to follow. Chacho cabin stood at the property's heart, a sturdy log structure that some long-ago homesteader had built to last. But even it seemed diminished, its windows dark as empty sockets, its chimney cold, despite the October chill that made Marcus's breath visible in the morning air. A creek did indeed run through the property, just as the banker had promised. But where it should have sparkled with clear water, it moved sluggishly, its surface reflecting nothing. The cottonwoods along its banks stood leafless, though autumn was only half spent, their branches reaching skyward like the arms of drowning men. Marcus guided Crow down the hillside, noting how the horse's ears flicked nervously as they approached the property line. Animals knew things men often missed, and Crow was telling him to be careful. But Marcus Stone had been careful his whole life, and careful hadn't saved anyone who mattered. The first sign of human presence came as he neared the cabin. Fresh footprints in the dust. Small ones, like children might make. They led from the direction of the creek toward the cabin's front door, then circled the building as if whoever made them had been looking for a way in. Marcus dismounted and ground-tied Crow near what had once been a vegetable garden. Now it was just a rectangle of dead earth, marked by the skeletal remains of tomato stakes and bean poles. He approached the cabin slowly, his hand resting naturally on the grip of his Colt. The front door hung slightly ajar. Marcus pushed it open with his boot, staying clear of the threshold until he could see inside. The cabin was empty, but showed signs of recent habitation, not by the previous owners, but by someone who had no business being there. A small fire had been built on the hearth, though it was cold now. Corn husks were scattered near the fireplace, as if someone had been trying to make something from them. More interesting were the marks scratched into the dirt floor near the door. Cherokee syllabary, the written form of the Cherokee language that Sequoia had given his people 60 years earlier. Marcus could read it, a skill acquired during 2 years spent recuperating from a bullet wound in a Cherokee settlement in the Nations. The marks spelled out words he recognized. Hungry. Help. Please. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying the cabin's interior. Someone had swept it recently, not thoroughly, but enough to make it habitable. A pile of rags in the corner suggested someone had been sleeping here. The desperate someone who had scratched Cherokee words into his floor. A sound from outside made him turn. Footsteps, trying to be quiet but betrayed by the crunch of dead leaves. Marcus stepped out of the cabin and saw them. 3 children standing at the edge of the clearing, poised to run, but held in place by some desperate hope. The oldest was a boy, maybe 12, with the straight black hair and bronze skin that marked him clearly as Cherokee. His clothes were clean but patched, his feet bare despite the cold. He stood protectively in front of 2 smaller children, a girl of perhaps 8 and another boy who couldn't be more than 6. All 3 were thin, not just lean, but hollow-cheeked thin. The kind that spoke of too many meals missed and too much. Hope deferred. The smallest boy clutched something in his hands, a crude doll made from corn husks, its face drawn on with charcoal. The older boy took a step forward, his chin raised in a gesture that was part defiance, part plea. When he spoke, his English was careful and precise, each word chosen with the gravity of someone who knows he gets only one chance. "We're starving bad, sir," he said, his voice cracking slightly on the words. "We've been living rough since the soldiers came. Ain't got nowhere else to go, and folks in town—" He swallowed hard. "They don't much like Cherokee kids asking for help." Marcus studied them without speaking. The boy's statement held layers. The mention of soldiers suggested a family displaced by one of the government's frequent relocations. The fact that they'd been living rough explained their presence in his cabin, and their current conditions spoke to the harsh reality that charity was often a luxury poor communities couldn't afford, especially when it came to Cherokee children whose own people were struggling to survive. This place got a curse on it. The boy continued, gesturing toward the barren fields. "Everybody knows it. White folks won't work it. Cherokee folks afraid to try. But mister, we got nothing left to lose. We can work. All 3 of us can work hard as grown folks. Just need someone to give us a chance." The girl spoke up then, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our mama said this land remembers things, says maybe it just needs folks who understand what it's trying to say." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. Not the physical pain that had plagued him since the bullet wound, but something deeper. These children were offering to work cursed land that grown men avoided, offering to bet their lives on soil that had defeated every previous attempt at cultivation. they were asking, not for charity but for the chance to prove their worth. He looked past them toward the fields again. In the growing light of full morning, he could see more clearly the patterns in the cracked earth. They weren't random. There was an intentionality to them, as if the land itself was trying to communicate. Something. The Cherokee girl was right. This place was trying to say something. The question was whether anyone was listening. The smallest boy took a step forward, holding out his cornhusk doll. "Her name's Hope," he said solemnly. "Mama made her before." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Marcus understood. Loss. Understood the weight of unfinished sentences and the objects left behind to carry the memory of love. Marcus knelt down, bringing himself to the child's eye level. Up close, he could see that the doll had been made with extraordinary care. The corn husks were woven in traditional Cherokee style, and the face, drawn with charcoal from a fire, bore the same dignified expression he saw on the boy's features. This wasn't just a toy. It was a link to heritage, to family, to hope itself. He reached out and gently touched the doll's cornhusk hair. The boy smiled. The first genuine smile Marcus had seen since arriving at the farm. It transformed the child's thin face, revealing the bright spirit that hunger and hardship hadn't been able to extinguish. Standing slowly, Marcus looked at each child in turn. The older boy met his gaze with steady determination. The girl watched him with curious intelligence. The youngest held Hope the doll close to his chest, his eyes wide, with the kind of trust that children give so freely and adults guard so carefully. They were asking him for more than work. They were asking him to believe in something. In them, in the possibility that cursed land might bloom again, in the chance that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships yield the most extraordinary results. Marcus Stone had spent 5 years in silence, letting his actions speak louder than any words ever could. Now, standing in the shadow of a cabin he'd bought from a desperate banker, looking at 3 Cherokee children who'd been failed by every adult who should have protected them, he made a decision that would change all their lives. He nodded once, a simple gesture that somehow conveyed acceptance, partnership, and the beginning of something that might just be hope. The older boy's shoulders sagged with relief so profound it was almost physical. The girl smiled shyly, and the youngest boy held out Hope the doll once more, this time not in desperation, but in offering. Marcus took the doll carefully, examining it with the attention it deserved. Then he handed it back and gestured toward the cabin. There was work to do and winter was coming, but for the first time in years, Marcus Stone felt like he might have found something worth working for. The morning sun climbed higher over the Blackwood farm, its light falling on cracked, earth and dead trees, on a silent cowboy and 3 Cherokee children whose hope had finally found an answer. The curse that had plagued this land for so long was about to meet something it had never encountered before. The combined determination of 4 souls who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The older boy's name was Samuel Ridgewalker, and he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone forced to become a man too soon. His sister was called Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in Cherokee, a cruel irony given how she'd withered under weeks of hunger. The youngest was Thomas, though his siblings called him Tommy, and he'd been born during the harsh winter of 1881 when the government rations ran shorter than usual. Marcus learned their names through careful listening as they spoke among themselves, in rapid Cherokee, switching to English only when addressing him directly. He understood more of their native tongue than they realized, but he kept that knowledge to himself. Trust, he'd learned, was something earned in drops and lost in buckets. The children had been living in his cabin for nearly 2 weeks, surviving on wild onions, acorns they'd managed to leach into edible meal, and the occasional rabbit Samuel had snared with traps made from braided grass. It was a testament to their Cherokee upbringing that they'd survived this long. Their grandmother had taught them which plants could sustain life and which would bring death, lessons that white children rarely learned. But knowledge of wild foods could only stretch so far when winter was approaching and the land itself seemed determined to offer nothing. Samuel stood straighter as Marcus approached, his thin shoulders squared against whatever judgment might come. "We cleaned your cabin best we could, mister. Didn't take nothing that wasn't already broken or thrown away. Tommy here, he's been keeping watch for you. Knew someone would come eventually." Marcus examined the boy's face, noting the intelligence, behind eyes that had seen too much. Samuel Ridgewalker was the kind of child who would grow into either a great leader or a dangerous outlaw, depending on what the world offered him in the next few crucial years. Ayanna stepped closer to her older brother, her hand finding his with the instinctive protectiveness of siblings who'd had only each other for too long. She was studying Marcus with the calculating gaze of someone who'd learned to read adult faces for signs of kindness or cruelty. "Our pa went to work the railroad," she said suddenly, her voice clear despite its softness. "Said he'd send money back for us and Mama. That was before the fever came through the settlement." Tommy pressed his cornhusk doll tighter to his chest, and Marcus saw the boy's lips move in silent conversation with hope. Children who talked to dolls were either very young or very lonely, and Tommy Ridgewalker looked like both. Marcus walked past them toward his horse, feeling their eyes follow his every movement. Crow nickered softly as he approached, and he ran a hand along her neck while considering his options. The smart thing would be to ride into the nearest town, find the Indian agent, and turn the children over to whatever family might claim them. It was the responsible thing, the legal thing. It was also likely a death sentence. Cherokee children without family often found themselves in boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man, as the government put it. Those who escaped that fate might end up as unpaid labor on white farms, or worse, simply forgotten by a system that viewed them as problems to be solved rather than people to be protected. Marcus opened his saddlebags and withdrew a cloth-wrapped package. Salt pork, hardtack, and a small bag of real coffee beans, supplies he'd purchased in the last town before riding to the farm. It wasn't much, but it represented the difference between surviving another week and slowly starving. He unwrapped the salt pork and handed it to Samuel, who accepted it with hands that trembled slightly. The boy's pride warred visibly with his hunger, and hunger won. He tore off a small piece and handed it to Ayanna, then broke off another for Tommy before taking a bite himself. The transformation was immediate. Color began returning to their faces, and Tommy actually giggled as he chewed, the sound bright and unexpected in the desolate clearing. Marcus found himself remembering another child's laughter from years past, before bullets and silence had changed everything. "You gonna let us stay?" Samuel asked around his mouthful of pork, trying to sound casual, but failing to hide the desperate hope in his voice. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the edge of the clearing and studied the fields that would supposedly be his livelihood. In the afternoon light, the patterns in the cracked earth seemed even more pronounced. They reminded him of something he'd seen before, though he couldn't quite place the memory. Ayanna appeared at his elbow, moving with the silent grace that Cherokee children learned early. "Grandmama used to say this place was where the earth got sad," she said quietly. "Long time ago, before the white farmers came, there was Cherokee families here, good families, working the land the way it wanted to be worked." She pointed toward a section of the field where the cracks formed an almost perfect circle. Grandmama said that's where they held ceremony. where they asked the spirits to bless the crops and the families and the seasons to come. Marcus looked down at her, seeing wisdom in her young face that went beyond her 8 years. What happened to them? Soldiers came in 1838, she said simply. Forced march to the territories. Most folks call it the Trail of Tears, but Cherokee folks, we just call it the time when everything died. She was talking about the Great Removal, when the U.S. government had forced 17,000 Cherokee from their ancestral lands in Georgia and surrounding states. Marcus knew the history. How 4,000 had died on the forced march west, how families had been torn apart, how an entire way of life had been shattered in the name of progress and manifest destiny. Grandmama said the earth here remembers. Ayana continued, remembers the families that got torn away, the crops that never got harvested, the ceremonies that got cut short. Says maybe that's why nothing grows right anymore. Land's still grieving. It was a child's explanation, filtered through the oral tradition of a displaced people. But as Marcus studied the barren fields, he found it made more sense than the banker's talk of bad soil and unfortunate weather patterns. Hope says the ground's thirsty, he announced matter-of-factly. Not for water, though, for something else. Samuel approached more cautiously, his eyes moving between Marcus and his siblings. You think we're just talking nonsense, he said, half statement and half question. White folks usually do. Marcus turned to face the boy fully, seeing the challenge in his stance. Samuel was testing him, trying to determine if this silent cowboy would be just another white man who dismissed Cherokee wisdom as superstition. Marcus knelt down and picked up a handful of the cracked earth. It felt wrong in his palm, not just dry, but somehow empty, as if something essential had been leached away. He rubbed it between his fingers, noting how it crumbled to dust, rather than holding together like healthy soil should. When he looked up, all 3 children were watching, him intently. Tommy had stopped drawing and was hugging Hope tighter. Ayana's dark eyes held a question she was too polite to ask. Samuel's jaw was set in anticipation of disappointment. Marcus stood slowly and looked back toward the cabin. Smoke should be rising from the chimney by now, if this were a normal homestead. There should be sounds of livestock, the rustle of chickens pecking in the yard, the lowing of cattle in the nearby pasture. Instead, there was only silence and the whisper of wind. Through dead grass, he thought about the previous owners the banker had mentioned, the ones who'd had bad luck. How many families had tried to make a life on this land? How many had failed and moved on, leaving behind nothing but broken dreams and deeper cracks in the unforgiving soil? The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and October. Nights in Oklahoma Territory could turn cold quickly. The children needed shelter, food, and warmth. But more than that, they needed something Marcus hadn't been able to give anyone in 5 years. They needed someone to believe in them. Samuel took a step closer, his young face grave with responsibility. Mister, I know you don't owe us nothing, but if you let us stay, we'll work harder than any grown folks you could hire. We know this land, know the Cherokee way of thinking about it. Maybe that's what it needs. We ain't asking for charity, Ayana added quickly. We're asking for partnership. You got the legal claim to this place, but we got the knowledge of how to heal it. Tommy looked up from his drawing, which Marcus now realized wasn't random scratches, but a remarkably accurate map of the field's crack patterns. Hope says, if we all work together, the sad ground might get happy again. Marcus found himself at a crossroads that went deeper than simple property ownership. These children weren't just asking for food and shelter. They were offering him something he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. They were offering him purpose. He'd bought this farm because it was cheap and isolated, a place where a silent man could live without bothering anyone or being bothered in return. But standing here in the fading afternoon light, watching 3 Cherokee children who'd been failed by every system that should have protected them, Marcus realized that isolation wasn't what he needed. What he needed was exactly what they were offering: partnership, shared purpose, and the chance to heal something that had been broken for far too long. The decision, when it came, felt as natural as breathing. Marcus walked back to his horse and began untying his bedroll. The gesture spoke louder than any words could have. He was staying, and by extension so were they. Samuel's face broke into a grin that transformed his serious features completely. Ayana clapped her hands together once, a gesture of pure joy. Tommy ran to Marcus and wrapped his thin arms around the cowboy's legs, still clutching hope in one hand. "We gonna fix this place," Tommy announced, with the absolute confidence that only 6-year-olds could muster. "Hope told me so." As the sun set over the Blackwood farm, painting the cracked earth in shades of gold and red, Marcus Stone found himself part of something he hadn't expected. A family born not of blood, but of shared determination and mutual need. The curse that had plagued this land was about to face its greatest challenge yet. 4 people who refused to accept that some things couldn't be healed, that some ground was too broken to bloom again. But first, they had to survive the winter, and that meant turning a cabin built for 1 into a home for 4, transforming individual survival into collective hope. The real work was just beginning. The first night passed in careful orchestration, like a dance between strangers learning each other's rhythm. Marcus spread his bedroll near the fireplace, while the children huddled together on the old straw mattress they'd been using. No one spoke about sleeping arrangements. Some understandings required no words. Samuel woke before dawn, as Marcus discovered when he opened his eyes to find the boy already stoking the fire with practiced efficiency. The 12-year-old moved with the quiet precision of someone who'd been taking care of others for longer than childhood should require. "Figured you'd want coffee," Samuel whispered, careful not to wake his siblings. "Found an old pot in the cabin yesterday. Cleaned it best I could." Marcus nodded and rose, his joints protesting the cold morning air. October in Oklahoma Territory could fool you with warm afternoons, but the nights carried the sharp promise of winter. He handed Samuel the precious coffee beans, watching as the boy's eyes widened at the luxury. "Real coffee," Samuel breathed, holding the beans to his nose. "Ain't had real coffee since—" He trailed off, but Marcus understood. Since before whatever tragedy had left 3 children fending for themselves in a hostile world. They worked together in comfortable silence, Samuel grinding beans between 2 stones while Marcus coaxed the fire higher. The cabin began to warm, and gradually Ayana and Tommy stirred, drawn by the rich aroma that spoke of comfort and normalcy. Tommy sat up first. Hope clutched against his chest, his dark hair sticking up at impossible angles. "Smells like Mama's kitchen," he said sleepily, then seemed to realize what he'd revealed. His small face crumpled for just a moment before he forced it back into careful composure. Ayana was at his side instantly, her arm around her little brother's shoulders. "It's okay, Tommy," she whispered in Cherokee, then switched to English, perhaps for Marcus's benefit. "Mama would be happy we found someone kind." The coffee, when it came, was strong enough to wake the dead, and bitter enough to make Marcus's eyes water, but he drank it gratefully while the children shared a single cup, passing it between them with the careful ritual of people who'd learned to make small pleasures last. "We need supplies," Marcus said finally, breaking the morning quiet. It was the longest sentence he'd spoken since arriving, and all 3 children looked at him with sudden attention. Samuel set down the coffee cup, his expression immediately serious. "Town's about 8 miles east, but Mr." He hesitated, glancing at his siblings. "Cherokee kids ain't exactly welcome in Millfield. Folks there got long memories about the land disputes." "Long memories and short tempers," Ayana added quietly. "Last time we went asking for work, shopkeeper threatened to call the marshal. Said we were probably thieves just looking for opportunities. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd seen this before. Communities that solved their economic anxieties by finding someone weaker to blame. Cherokee children made easy targets, especially ones without family to protect them. "You stay here," he said, rising to check his rifle. "I'll go alone." "No, sir," Samuel said firmly, standing as well. "Respectfully, you don't know what you're walking into. Millfield's got some good people, but it's also got Jeremiah Colt and his boys. They run most of the businesses, and they got particular ideas about who belongs in their territory." The name Jeremiah Colt rang familiar, though Marcus couldn't place where he'd heard it. Samuel seemed to read his expression. "Colt claims his grandfather lost good farmland to Cherokee families before the removal," Samuel explained. "Course that was land the Cherokee had legal title to, but Colt don't much care about legal when it comes to Indians. He's been stirring up trouble for any Cherokee trying to make an honest living in these parts." Marcus absorbed this information while checking his sidearm. Violence wasn't his preference, but he'd learned long ago that sometimes the threat of violence was the only thing that kept actual violence at bay. Tommy appeared at his elbow, Hope extended in both hands. "Hope says she wants to come with you," the boy announced solemnly. "Says maybe she can help." The gesture was so innocent, so trusting, that Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. This child was offering to send his most precious possession into potential danger because he believed it might help a man who'd known them for less than 24 hours. Marcus knelt down and carefully took the corn husk doll, noting the intricate weaving, the careful charcoal features, the way it had been mended and remended with loving hands. "I'll keep her safe," he promised, tucking Hope into his shirt pocket where she'd be protected but visible. "Folks see you got Cherokee children's things," Ayana said thoughtfully. "Might make them think different about you. Sometimes white folks treat Indians better when they think other white folks are watching." It was a sophisticated understanding of social dynamics for an 8-year-old, but then again, Cherokee children grew up navigating a world where reading white intentions could mean the difference between safety and disaster. The ride to Millfield gave Marcus time to think. Crow picked her way along the rutted road while he considered what he was really committing to. Taking in 3 Cherokee children wasn't just about providing food and shelter. It was about standing between them and a world that had already demonstrated its hostility. The town of Millfield materialized out of the prairie like a collection of weathered prayers. Main Street stretched for 4 blocks, lined with the usual frontier establishments: general store, saloon, hotel, blacksmith, and a small building that served as both courthouse and jail. The railroad had come through 5 years earlier, bringing enough prosperity to support a population of maybe 300 souls. Marcus tied Crow outside Morrison's general store and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk. Through the window, he could see shelves lined with supplies: flour, beans, preserved meat, the basics of frontier survival. A bell jingled as he pushed open the door. The proprietor, a thin man with suspicious eyes, looked up from his ledger. "Help you?" Marcus placed a handwritten list on the counter, supplies for 4 people to last at least 2 weeks. The shopkeeper, whose nameplate read H. Morrison, scanned the list with growing interest. "Planning to feed an army?" Morrison asked, his tone carefully neutral. Marcus shook his head and placed cash on the counter, enough to cover the supplies. With money left over, Morrison's demeanor shifted immediately at the sight of actual currency rather than promises to pay later. "You're the fellow bought the Blackwood place," Morrison said, beginning to gather items from the shelves. "Heard someone finally took old banker Williams up on that deal. Most folks around here figured that land was cursed for good." Marcus remained silent, watching as Morrison filled his order with professional efficiency. But he noticed the man's eyes kept flicking toward the front window as if expecting someone. "Word of advice," Morrison continued, wrapping salt pork in brown paper. You might want to think twice about whatever you're planning out there. That land's got a reputation for breaking folks. 3 families tried to work it in the past 10 years. None lasted more than a season. The bell jingled again, and Marcus felt the temperature in the store drop several degrees. 3 men entered, led by someone who could only be Jeremiah Colt. He was a big man, well-fed and confident, wearing the kind of suit that announced prosperity to anyone who cared to notice. "Well now," Colt said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to being the most important person in the room. "Morrison, you didn't mention we had a new neighbor." Morrison's hands stilled on the supplies. "Just business, Mr. Colt. Fellows buying provisions." Colt approached the counter, his 2 companions flanking him like well-trained dogs. "Jeremiah Colt," he said, extending a hand toward Marcus. "I run most of the commercial interests in this area. Welcome to Millfield." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting Colt's deliberately firm grip and the way the man's eyes catalogued everything: the quality of Marcus's clothes, the well-maintained Colt at his hip, the supplies piling up on the counter. "You're the one bought the Blackwood curse," Colt said, making it sound like a statement of fact rather than a question. "Hope you got more sense than the last few fools who tried to work that devil ground." Marcus remained silent, but Colt seemed to interpret this as invitation to continue. "See, the thing about that land," Colt said, leaning against the counter with practiced casualness, "is it's got a history. Bad history. Indians used to hold their heathen ceremonies there back before the government moved them where they belonged. Left some kind of spiritual contamination, if you believe in such things." One of Colt's companions, a lean man with mean eyes, spoke up. "Course, some folks say the real problem is Indians still sneaking back, trying to reclaim what they think is theirs. Might be why crops keep failing. Somebody's sabotaging efforts to work the land proper." Marcus felt Hope's small weight in his shirt pocket, a reminder of the trust 3 children had placed in him. Tommy's voice echoed in his memory. "Hope says she wants to come with you, says maybe she can help." "Now, I'm not saying that's what's happening," Colt continued smoothly, "but if it was, and if a new landowner found evidence of trespassing or vandalism, well, the marshal's a reasonable man. He understands the importance of protecting legitimate property rights." The threat was clear, wrapped in the civilized language of legal process, but carrying the unmistakable scent of violence. Marcus understood now why Samuel had been worried about coming to town. Morrison finished wrapping the supplies, his movements quick and nervous. "That'll be $4.60, he said, clearly hoping to conclude the transaction before it escalated. Marcus paid without comment and began loading supplies into a burlap sack. Colt watched the process with calculating eyes. "You know," Colt said conversationally, "I've been thinking about making an offer on that Blackwood place. Nothing personal, you understand, but I've got the resources to handle whatever problems might arise, might save you a lot of trouble in the long run." Marcus hoisted the supply sack over his shoulder and looked Colt directly in the eye. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken challenge and the kind of tension that made other men step back. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the store. "Not interested." It was only 2 words, but they contained volumes. Not interested in selling, not interested in intimidation, not interested in whatever game Colt thought he was playing. Colt's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Well, now that's your right as a property owner. Just remember, neighbor, this territory can be hard on folks who don't understand how things work around here." Marcus touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that could be interpreted as politeness, but felt more like dismissal. He walked toward the door, aware that every eye in the store was following his movement. As he reached for the door handle, Tommy's cornhusk doll shifted in his pocket, a small reminder of the 3 faces waiting for his return. Hope the doll, who had wanted to help, who had been offered as a talisman of trust by a 6-year-old boy who'd already lost too much. Marcus paused and looked back at Colt, who was still watching him with predatory interest. When Marcus spoke, again, his voice carried a different quality, not just determination, but something approaching promise. "The Blackwood place has new management," he said simply. "Might want to keep that in mind." Then he pushed through the door and stepped into the afternoon sunshine, leaving behind a store full of men who were just beginning to understand they'd misjudged the silent cowboy who'd bought the cursed farm. The ride back to the homestead gave Marcus time to process what had just occurred. He'd made his choice public now, declared himself in opposition to forces that had run unopposed in this territory for years. There would be consequences, and those consequences would affect not just him, but 3 Cherokee children who'd already suffered enough. But as Crow carried him through the October afternoon, Marcus found himself thinking not about the dangers ahead, but about the trust that had been placed in him. Tommy offering hope as protection, Samuel sharing precious coffee, Ayanna explaining her grandmother's wisdom about grieving land. These children hadn't just asked for rescue, they'd offered partnership, knowledge, and hope in return. They'd recognized something in him that he'd forgotten about himself, the capacity to stand for something larger than mere survival. By the time he crested the hill overlooking the Blackwood farm, Marcus Stone had made more than a decision to help 3 hungry children. He'd made a commitment to become the kind of man who deserved their trust. The cabin's chimney was smoking, and he could see small figures moving around the yard. They'd been watching for his return, and as Crow carried him down the slope, Marcus reached into his pocket to touch Hope's corn husk hair. "We're going to be all right," he told the little doll quietly. "All of us." It was a promise he intended to keep, no matter what Jeremiah Colt and his allies had in mind for the silent cowboy and his Cherokee family. The children were waiting in the yard when Marcus returned, their faces bright with relief that transformed to wonder as they saw the bulging supply sack. Tommy ran to greet him, arms outstretched for hope, while Samuel and Ayanna hung back with the careful restraint of those who'd learned not to get their hopes too high. "Hope missed you," Tommy announced solemnly as Marcus handed back the cornhusk doll. "She said the town smelled like fear and anger." Marcus glanced at the boy sharply. Children sometimes saw truths that adults preferred to ignore, and Tommy's observation was uncomfortably accurate. Millfield did smell like fear, the kind that fermented into hatred when left unchecked. "Any trouble?" Samuel asked, his young face grave with premature responsibility. Marcus began unpacking supplies, letting his actions answer before his words. Real flour, not the cornmeal they'd been stretching, salt pork wrapped in brown paper, a small bag of actual sugar, precious as gold coins in this territory. Beans, coffee, even a tin of peaches that made Ayanna gasp with delight. "Some," Marcus admitted finally. "Man named Jeremiah Colt says he's got interests in this area." Samuel's expression darkened immediately. "You met Colt? What did he want?" "The farm. And probably to make sure we understand the rules around here." Ayanna moved closer, her small hands clasped together. "What kind of rules?" Marcus knelt down to her level, meeting her intelligent dark eyes. "The kind that say Cherokee children don't belong on good farmland. The kind that might cause problems if we're not careful." He wouldn't lie to them. They'd survived this long by understanding harsh realities, and they deserved the truth about what they were facing. But he also wouldn't let fear paralyze them. "That's why we need to make this place safe," Marcus continued. "Really safe. Not just from weather and hunger, but from people who might want to make trouble." Tommy looked up from where he was whispering to Hope. "How do we make it safe from people?" It was a 6-year-old's question, but it cut to the heart of their situation. How do you protect 3 Cherokee children in a territory where being Cherokee was treated as a crime? "First thing," Marcus said, standing and surveying the property with new eyes. "We need to know when someone's coming before they get here." Samuel nodded, understanding immediately. "You want to set up lookout points?" "More than that. We need this whole farm to work like one big early warning system." Marcus walked toward the creek, noting how its meandering path gave natural sight lines across the property. The cottonwoods along its banks were leafless now, but they were tall enough to serve as observation points. More importantly, the creek's course would channel any approaching riders toward predictable crossing points. "Samuel, you've been hunting these woods. Show me every game trail, every natural path someone might use to approach without being seen." Over the next hour, the boy led Marcus through a comprehensive tour of the property's vulnerabilities. Samuel had learned to think like prey during the weeks he'd been protecting his siblings, and that knowledge translated perfectly to defensive planning. "Most folks would come straight up the main road," Samuel explained, pointing toward the rutted track that led to town. "But if someone wanted to sneak up, they'd probably use this old cattle path here, or maybe follow the creek bed from the north." Marcus nodded, already formulating plans. "We'll need signal systems, ways to communicate danger without shouting." Ayanna appeared at his shoulder with the silent grace that seemed natural to her family. "Cherokee scouts used to use bird calls," she said quietly. "Different calls for different kinds of danger. Grandmama taught us some before." She trailed off, but Marcus understood. Before their grandmother died, leaving 3 children with knowledge but no protection. "Teach me," Marcus said simply. For the rest of the afternoon, they worked on establishing their security systems. Ayanna demonstrated the Cherokee calls, a whippoorwill's cry for strangers approaching, a hawk's shriek for immediate danger, an owl's hoot for all clear. Tommy, despite his age, proved remarkably good at mimicking the sounds, his young voice carrying clearly across the property. Marcus set up simple early warning devices, strings tied to cans that would rattle if someone approached through the woods, carefully placed branches that would crack underfoot if disturbed. Nothing elaborate, but effective against anyone who didn't know to look for them. But physical security was only part of what these children needed. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Marcus realized they required something more fundamental. The security of routine, of normal life, of childhood preserved despite harsh circumstances. "Tommy!" he called as the boy practiced bird calls with Hope as his audience. "You know anything about cooking?" The child's face lit up. "Mama taught me to make corn cakes, and Ayanna knows how to cook rabbit stew that tastes almost like chicken." "Well, then," Marcus said, gesturing toward the supplies, "seems like we ought to have ourselves a proper supper, celebrate our first day as—" He paused, searching for the right word. "As a family," Samuel finished quietly. The word hung in the evening air, carrying weight that none of them had expected. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, not the old pain, but something newer and more complicated. Hope, maybe. Or responsibility, or the beginning of healing he'd thought was impossible. Inside the cabin, they worked together to prepare what felt like a feast after weeks of subsistence. Ayanna took charge of the cooking with the competence of someone who'd been doing it far longer than her 8 years should have required. Samuel kept the fire at exactly the right temperature, while Tommy set out their few dishes with the seriousness of a formal dinner. Marcus found himself assigned to the simple task of slicing bread, but even that felt significant. When had he last shared a meal with other people? When had he last cared about the quality of food beyond its ability to keep him alive? As they ate, the children told him stories about their life before, fragments of memory that painted a picture of a Cherokee family trying to maintain traditional ways while adapting to an increasingly hostile world. Their father had worked railroad construction, sending money home when he could. Their mother had taken in washing and mending, teaching her children to read and write in both English and Cherokee syllabary. Mama always said education was the one thing nobody could take away from us, Ayana explained around a mouthful of beans. Said knowledge was like seeds. You could carry it anywhere and plant it in new ground. Samuel nodded solemnly. That's why we've been teaching Tommy his letters, even without proper books. Mama made us promise we'd keep learning no matter what happened. Marcus listened to these glimpses of their parents with growing understanding. These children weren't just survivors. They were the carriers of specific hopes and dreams. Their parents had invested everything in the belief that education and perseverance would eventually triumph over prejudice and poverty. It was a heavy burden for such young shoulders, but they carried it with dignity that humbled him. After supper, as they sat around the fire sharing the tin of precious peaches, Tommy made an announcement that changed everything. "Hope wants to tell a story," he said seriously, holding up the corn-husk doll. "She says it's important for Marcus to hear it." Samuel and Ayana exchanged glances that spoke of long familiarity with their brother's conversations with his doll. But instead of the indulgent smiles Marcus expected, their faces showed genuine attention. "What story does Hope want to tell?" Marcus asked, settling back in his chair. Tommy held Hope close to his ear, as if listening to whispered words. Then he looked up with the solemn expression that made him seem far older than 6. Hope says, a long time ago, there was a Cherokee man who found 3 white children lost in the woods. They were hungry and scared, and their parents were gone. The Cherokee man could have left them there. White folks hadn't been kind to his people, but instead he took them home and raised them like they were his own. Tommy paused, stroking Hope's corn-husk hair. The children grew up learning Cherokee ways and white ways both. When they became adults, they used both kinds of knowledge to help people, Cherokee and white both. Hope says maybe that's what's supposed to happen here too. Maybe the broken ground needs both kinds of knowing to heal. The story hung in the firelit cabin like a benediction. Marcus found himself thinking about the cracked patterns in the earth outside, the way they seemed to follow some intentional design that regular farming couldn't address. "Hope's pretty smart," he said finally. Tommy beamed. "She says the earth remembers kindness too, not just sadness. Says when people choose love instead of fear, the ground starts to trust again." It was a child's wisdom, filtered through the voice of a cornhusk doll, but it carried truth that made Marcus's throat tight. These children were offering him more than partnership in working cursed land. They were offering him the chance to plant something better in soil that had known too much sorrow. As they prepared for bed, Marcus made practical arrangements that felt ceremonial in their significance. He moved his bedroll to a position where he could watch both the door and the window, establishing himself as guardian. The children arranged their sleeping space with the easy cooperation of siblings who'd learned to find comfort in each other. But before they settled for the night, Ayana approached Marcus with something clutched in her small hands. "This was Grandmama's," she said, offering him a small leather pouch decorated with beadwork in traditional Cherokee patterns. "She said it holds protection prayers. Mama gave it to me when the fever came, said I should keep it safe for when we found our real home." She pressed the pouch into Marcus's hands, her dark eyes serious. "I think this is our real home now. And I think you should carry Grandmama's prayers since you're the one protecting us." Marcus accepted the pouch with the reverence it deserved, understanding that he was being entrusted with more than just a family heirloom. He was being given a place in their spiritual as well as physical family. That night, as he listened to the children's quiet breathing and the settling sounds of the old cabin, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not just the absence of conflict, but the positive presence of rightness, of being exactly where he was supposed to be. Outside, the October wind carried the promise of harder weather to come. Somewhere in Millfield, Jeremiah Colt was probably planning ways to make trouble for the silent cowboy and his Cherokee family. The cursed earth of Blackwood Farm still lay barren under the stars, its healing dependent on knowledge and hope that might not be enough. But inside the cabin, 4 people who'd found each other against impossible odds were building something that felt stronger than curse or prejudice or fear. They were building home. Marcus's hand found the leather pouch Ayanna had given him, feeling the prayers sewn into its beadwork by hands long stilled. Protection prayers, she'd said, for when they found their real home. As sleep finally claimed him, Marcus Stone realized that for the first time in 5 years, he had something worth protecting that went beyond mere survival. He had family, responsibility, and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were safe, fed, and together. In a world that had shown them mostly cruelty, they'd found a small circle of warmth and belonging. It was enough to build on. It was enough to fight for. Outside, the wind whispered through the bare cottonwoods, and the cursed earth lay waiting for the healing that might come with spring. 3 weeks into November, the Blackwood Farm began to show signs of life that had nothing to do with crops or livestock. It started with small things. Tommy's laughter echoing from the barn, where he played hide-and-seek with Hope, Ayanna's voice raised in Cherokee lullabies as she worked. Samuel's patient explanations of traditional hunting techniques that Marcus had never encountered in his years of solitary survival. The mornings had developed their own rhythm. Marcus woke before dawn to check the perimeter and tend to crow, while Samuel built up the fire and Ayanna prepared whatever breakfast their supplies allowed. Tommy's job was to gather eggs from the 3 scrawny chickens Marcus had purchased from a farmer outside Millfield, hens so bedraggled that the seller had seemed grateful to get rid of them. But under Tommy's devoted care, the chickens had begun to thrive. He'd named them Faith, Grace, and Charity, and spoke to them in the same serious tone he used with Hope. The birds, perhaps responding to genuine affection they'd rarely received, had started laying regularly for the first time in months. "Faith laid 2 eggs today," Tommy announced proudly on this particular morning, holding up his treasures. "She told me she's feeling stronger now that she's got a proper family to take care of." Ayanna smiled as she cracked the eggs into the iron skillet. "Looks like Faith's got good judgment." It was these moments, ordinary domestic exchanges that held extraordinary meaning, that were weaving them together into something that felt increasingly like a real family. Marcus found himself looking forward to Tommy's daily chicken reports, to Ayanna's quiet observations about the weather or the changing season, to Samuel's thoughtful questions about farming techniques. But it was the evenings that revealed how deep their connection was growing. After supper, when the day's work was done and the fire cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls, they'd developed the habit of sharing stories. Not just Cherokee legends or frontier tales, but personal memories that painted pictures of who they'd been before fate brought them together. Marcus had begun talking more, his natural reserve gradually melting under the warmth of genuine interest. He told them about his childhood in Missouri, about learning to track from an old mountain man named Jake Weatherby, about the satisfaction of reading sign that most people couldn't see. "Signs like a language," he explained one evening while carving a wooden horse for Tommy. "Every broken twig, every disturbed patch of earth, every scat pile tells you something. You learn to read it right, and the woods start talking to you." Samuel leaned forward eagerly. "Cherokee scouts learned the same thing, but they also read the spirits in the land. Grandpapa used to say the earth itself would tell you where the deer would come to drink, where the best medicine plants would grow, where danger might be hiding." "Show me," Marcus said simply. The next morning, Samuel led him on what the boy called a listening walk. They moved through the woods behind the farm with Cherokee silence, stopping frequently while Samuel pointed out signs that Marcus had learned to see but never to hear. "See how the oak leaves are bunched up there?" Samuel whispered, indicating a spot where dead leaves had collected against a fallen log. "That's not just wind. Something's been bedding there regular. But look at the way the leaves are pressed down. That's not deer sign. Too heavy, too spread out. Could be a bear getting ready for winter sleep." Marcus examined the depression more carefully, noting details he'd missed. Samuel was right. The pattern suggested something larger than deer, something that had been returning to this spot repeatedly. "How do you know it's not just a big buck?" Samuel pointed to scratches on the oak's bark, high above what a deer could reach. "Bear marks. Fresh ones too, maybe 3-4 days old. He's marking territory, telling other bears this sleeping spot is taken." It was impressive woodcraft for a 12-year-old, but more than that, it revealed how Cherokee knowledge differed from the frontier tracking Marcus had learned. Where his education had focused on hunting and avoiding danger, Cherokee tradition seemed to emphasize understanding the land's rhythms, its seasonal patterns, its spiritual as well as physical dimensions. Grandpapa said the bear's getting ready. "To dream the winter away," Samuel continued. "He dreams for all of us during the cold time, dreams of spring returning, of new grass and running water and babies being born. His dreams keep the world turning until the warm season comes back." Marcus found himself oddly moved by this explanation. His own frontier upbringing had taught him to see bears as dangerous competitors for resources. The Cherokee perspective suggested they were partners in the land's seasonal cycle, essential players in maintaining natural balance. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." Samuel's face clouded. He was on the trail of tears, made it to the territories, but he was never the same after leaving the old country. Mama said he kept dreaming about the mountains we'd lost, kept expecting to wake up back home in Georgia. The conversation revealed something important about why this particular piece of land had called to Cherokee memory. It wasn't just that ceremonial sites had been disturbed or that traditional farming methods had been abandoned. The earth itself was homesick, grieving for the people who'd understood its spiritual significance. That afternoon, while Marcus worked on reinforcing the barn door, Ayanna approached him with a request that surprised him. "Would you teach me to shoot?" she asked quietly, glancing toward where her brothers were playing near the creek. Marcus looked up from his work, noting the serious set of her young face. "You afraid of something specific?" "I'm afraid of being helpless," she said, with startling directness. "Samuel's learning to be a man. He can protect himself and Tommy if he has to. But I'm just a girl, and girls are supposed to need protecting all the time. That's fine when there's someone around to do the protecting, but what if something happens? To you, it was a sobering question from an 8-year-old, but it reflected the harsh realities she'd already faced. Cherokee girls often learn practical skills earlier than their white counterparts, and Ayanna had been forced to grow up faster than most. "All right," Marcus said, setting down his hammer. "But we do this right. Gun safety first, target practice second, and you never touch a weapon unless I'm there to supervise." Over the following days, he taught her the fundamentals: how to hold a rifle properly, how to sight along the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze rather than jerk the trigger. She was a natural student, patient with the repetitive practice that good marksmanship required, but more importantly, the lessons gave them time alone together, opportunities for conversations that revealed the sharp intelligence behind her quiet demeanor. "Marcus," she said one afternoon while cleaning the rifle they'd been practicing with, "do you think the land really remembers things?" He considered the question seriously. "What do you think?" "I think it does, but not the way people remember. More like the way water remembers which way to flow, or the way trees remember which direction to grow toward the sun. Not thoughts exactly, but patterns that get set and then keep repeating." It was a sophisticated concept for someone her age, but it made intuitive sense. If land could develop patterns of fertility or barrenness, success or failure, maybe those patterns could become self-reinforcing over time, "So how do you change the patterns?" Marcus asked. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, her small hands working methodically to clean the rifle's action. "Grandmama used to say you had to give the land new memories, happy memories, show it that people could love it instead of just using it." That evening, Tommy provided his own insight into the farm's spiritual condition during one of his regular conversations with Hope. "Hope says the ground is starting to remember good things," he announced while they shared their evening meal. "She says it likes hearing us laugh, likes seeing us take care of the chickens, likes knowing someone's here who won't hurt it." Samuel looked up from his plate of beans. "How does Hope know all this?" Tommy considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all matters involving his doll. "Hope says Corn remembers everything, 'cause Corn has been with people since the beginning. Every Cherokee family that ever lived, Corn was there too. So Corn dolls know all the old stories, all the ways people used to be happy together." It was, the kind of explanation that would sound like childish fantasy in most contexts, but here in the lamplight of the Blackwood cabin, it felt like wisdom. Tommy was processing complex ideas about tradition, memory, and healing through the safe distance of his doll's voice. Marcus found himself taking these insights seriously, incorporating them into his understanding of what they were trying to accomplish. They weren't just farming cursed land. They were attempting to heal collective trauma, to replace patterns of failure and sorrow with patterns of cooperation and hope. The breakthrough came during the 4th week of November, when an early snowfall forced them to spend 3 days inside the cabin together. Instead of feeling cramped or irritable, they discovered new depths to their growing connection. Samuel taught Marcus to play a Cherokee gambling game involving carved peach pits, while Ayana showed him how to weave grass into useful baskets. Tommy, with Hope's guidance, created elaborate stories that seemed to blend Cherokee mythology with frontier, tall tales. But the most significant moment came when Marcus finally told them about his own past, not just the surface facts he'd shared before, but the deeper truth about why he'd chosen silence as his preferred language. "I had a family once," he said quietly, while the wind howled outside and the fire painted their faces in warm gold. "Wife named Catherine, daughter named Mary. They died of cholera while I was away on a cattle drive. By the time I got back, they'd been in the ground for 2 weeks. The cabin grew very still. Even Tommy stopped whispering to Hope. I kept thinking if I'd been there, if I'd said the right words, done the right things, maybe I could have saved them. Took me a long time to understand that some things can't be talked away or reasoned with or negotiated. Sometimes all you can do is decide what you're going to do next." Ayana moved closer to him, her small hand finding his arm. "What did you decide to do next?" "I decided to stop making promises I couldn't keep. Stop telling people things would be all right when I had no way of knowing. Words got to mean something, or they don't mean anything at all." Samuel nodded slowly. "Is that why you hardly talked when you first came here?" "Partly. Also because I'd forgotten how to be around people who might matter to me. Forgotten how to care about someone else's happiness." Tommy looked up from Hope, his young face grave with understanding beyond his years. "Hope says you remember now. Says that's why the ground's getting less sad. Because you remember how to love people." Again, the simple statement hit Marcus with unexpected force. Over the past month, he had been remembering not just how to care for others, but how to hope, how to plan for a future that included more than mere survival, how to believe that broken things might be made whole again. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep, Marcus sat by the dying fire and thought about the family they were becoming. Not the family he'd lost. Nothing could replace Catherine and Mary, but something new and different and equally precious. Outside, the November snow continued falling, covering the cracked earth of Blackwood Farm with a blanket of white that made everything look clean and full of possibility. Spring would come eventually, And when it did, they would plant seeds in soil that had been prepared not just with plows and fertilizer, but with love and hope and the kind of memories that heal rather than wound. For the first time since Catherine's death, Marcus Stone found himself looking forward to tomorrow and the day after that, and all the tomorrows that would follow. He had work to do, children to raise, and land to heal. But more than that, he had a reason to believe that sometimes, if you're very lucky and very persistent and very willing to love with an open heart, broken things really can be made whole. Again, the wind outside sang through the bare cottonwoods, but inside the cabin all was warmth and peace, and the quiet breathing of family safe together through another night. Spring was still months away, but hope had already taken root. December arrived with a snowstorm that buried the Blackwood farm under 2 feet of white silence. For 3 days, the world beyond their cabin door ceased to exist, reduced to nothing but howling wind and the endless whisper of falling snow. Inside, the 4 of them lived in a cocoon of lamplight and firelight, sharing meals and stories and the peculiar intimacy that comes when people have nowhere to go but deeper into each other's trust. It was during this enforced isolation that Marcus made a decision that would change all their lives forever. He'd been watching Tommy teach Hope to read by tracing letters in the flour they'd spilled on the cabin table, listening to Samuel plan elaborate improvements for the farm come spring, seeing Ayanna carefully mend a tear in his favorite shirt with stitches so tiny they were almost invisible. These children had been caring for him as naturally as breathing, weaving themselves into his daily existence until he couldn't imagine morning coffee without Samuel's quiet presence or evening meals without Ayanna's gentle efficiency. But they were still children without legal protection, Cherokee children in a territory that viewed their very existence as problematic. If something happened to him, if he took sick, or if Jeremiah Colt's threats escalated beyond mere intimidation, they would be defenseless again, thrown back on the mercy of a world that had already demonstrated its cruelty. That couldn't be allowed to happen, not to these children, not to his family. The realization that he was thinking of them as family startled him less than it should have. Over the weeks since that first desperate encounter in the yard, they'd become essential to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Samuel's steady dependability, Ayanna's quiet wisdom, Tommy's innocent joy. They'd filled spaces in his heart he'd thought were permanently closed. But being family in reality and being family in the eyes of the law were 2 different things. Entirely. On the morning after the storm finally cleared, Marcus announced his intentions while they shared breakfast around the cabin's small table. "I need to ride to the territorial capital," he said, cutting straight to the heart of what he'd been planning. "Got some legal business to attend to." Samuel looked up from his oatmeal, immediately alert. "What kind of legal business?" Marcus met the boy's intelligent eyes directly. "The kind that makes you 3 officially my responsibility. Legal guardianship papers, adoption papers, if the territorial court will allow it." The silence that followed was so complete that the crackling of the fire sounded loud as gunshots. Tommy's spoon halfway to his mouth, dripping oatmeal back into his bowl. Ayanna's hands went very still on her coffee cup. Samuel's face cycled through surprise, hope, and something that might have been fear. "You mean—" Ayanna's voice was barely above a whisper. "You mean you want to keep us? Really keep us forever?" "I mean, I want to make it legal that you belong here," Marcus said carefully. "Want to make sure if anything happens to me, you've got protections. Want to make sure nobody can come along and say Cherokee children got no business on this land." Tommy set down his spoon entirely and picked up Hope, holding her close to his ear in the gesture that meant he was processing something too big for his 6-year-old understanding. After a moment, he looked up with solemn eyes. "Hope says that means we'd be really truly family, not just pretend family." "That's right," Marcus confirmed. Samuel's voice, when it came, was thick with emotion he was trying to control. What if the court says no? What if they say Cherokee kids can't be adopted by white folks? It was a legitimate concern. Territorial law regarding indigenous children was inconsistent at best, often contradictory, always influenced by prevailing prejudices. Marcus had spent sleepless nights worrying about exactly that possibility. "Then we keep being family anyway," he said firmly. "Papers don't make family, hearts do. But papers help protect family, and that's what I want for you. All the protection the law can give." Ayana stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered fields. Her small shoulders were rigid with tension Marcus couldn't read. "Ayana," he said gently, "you got concerns about this?" She turned around slowly, and he was shocked to see tears streaming down her face. "Our real papa," she said in a voice that broke halfway through. "He promised he'd come back for us. Said he was just going to work the railroad until he saved enough money for a house in town. Said he'd send for us when he got settled." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Marcus suddenly understood her distress. Accepting legal adoption from him meant accepting that their father wasn't coming back, wasn't going to fulfill his promises, wasn't going to reclaim his children. It meant letting go of hope they'd been carrying like a candle flame in a dark place. Samuel moved to his sister's side, his arm going around her shoulders with protective instinct. "Ayana, Papa's been gone for over a year. If he was coming back—" "I know," she said fiercely. "I know he's probably dead or lost, or maybe just forgot about us when life got hard. I know we can't keep waiting forever. But saying yes to Marcus feels like saying Papa never mattered, like we're just throwing him away." Marcus felt his chest tighten with understanding. These children had been abandoned before, by circumstances if not by choice, and they were terrified of betraying their memory of parents who'd loved them even if they hadn't been able to protect them. "What was your papa's name?" Marcus asked quietly. "Joseph Ridgewalker," Samuel answered when Ayana couldn't. "Joseph Ridgewalker of the Cherokee Nation, born in the old territories, lost everything in the land frauds of '85. Marcus nodded slowly. "And your mama?" "Sarah Ridgewalker," Ayana whispered. "Sarah dear in the morning before she married Papa." "Then here's what we're going to do," Marcus said, rising and walking to the cabin's one bookshelf where he kept his few precious possessions. He pulled out a leather-bound Bible, its pages worn soft from years of handling. "This belonged to my wife Catherine," he explained, returning to the table. "Every important thing that ever happened in her family got written down in the front. Pages, births, deaths, marriages, all of it." He opened the Bible to the family record pages, showing them the careful handwriting that documented generations of births and deaths, loves and losses. "If you'll let me, I want to write your parents. Names in here, Joseph Ridgewalker and Sarah Deer in the morning. I want to write down that they were good parents who loved their children and did everything they could to keep them safe. I want their names to be part of our family record forever." He looked at each child in turn. "Adopting you doesn't erase where you came from. It just gives you somewhere safe to go forward. Your Cherokee names, your Cherokee heritage, your parents' memory, all of that comes with you. All of that becomes part of this family's story." Tommy climbed down from his chair and approached Marcus with Hope clutched against his chest. Would Hope be adopted too? The question was so innocently serious that Marcus had to swallow hard before answering. "Hope would be adopted too. She's part of this family, isn't she?" "Yes," Tommy said solemnly. "Hope says she'd like that very much." Ayana wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and returned to the table, her expression still, troubled but less desperate. "What would happen to our Cherokee names? Would we have to take your name instead? You'd be Samuel, Ayana, and Tommy Stone for legal purposes," Marcus explained. "But Cherokee names are heart names, soul names. Those stay with you forever, no matter what any paper says. Samuel had been quiet through this exchange, but now he spoke with the gravity that made him seem far older than 12. If we do this, if we become Stone family legally, what does that make us to each other? Are you our father now, or our guardian, or what? It was the heart of the matter, the question that would define their relationship going forward. Marcus considered his answer carefully. "I'm whatever you need me to be," he said finally. "You want to call me father? I'd be honored. You want to call me Marcus? That's fine too. You want to call me guardian or friend or just the man who takes care of things? Any of that works for me. What matters is that we choose each other, all of us, and we mean it when we do." The conversation continued for hours, with Marcus patiently answering every question, addressing every fear, explaining every aspect of what legal adoption would and wouldn't change. By afternoon, when the winter sun was slanting low through the cabin windows, they'd reached their decision. "We want to try," Samuel said, speaking for all three of them with the authority of eldest child and natural leader. "We want to be Stone family legally, but Cherokee family always. Stone Ridgewalker family," Ayanna corrected firmly, "so nobody ever forgets where we came from." Marcus nodded agreement. "Stone Ridgewalker family it is." That evening, he carefully wrote their parents' names in Catherine's Bible, documenting their lives and their love in the permanent record of family memory. Then below their names he wrote, "Beloved parents of Samuel, Ayanna, and Thomas Ridgewalker, who became Samuel, Ayanna, and Thomas Stone Ridgewalker, by choice and by love, December 15th, 1887. The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect weather for the long ride to the territorial capital. Marcus prepared for a journey that might take weeks, depending on weather and the vagaries of territorial bureaucracy. But first, there were practical matters to address. He couldn't leave 3 children alone on an isolated farm in the middle of winter, not with men like Jeremiah Colt making threats about Cherokee trespassers. The solution came from an unexpected source. Thomas Webb, a neighboring farmer who'd been quietly friendly despite community pressure, appeared at their door the evening before Marcus planned to leave. "Heard through the grapevine you might be traveling soon," Webb said, removing his hat as he entered the cabin. "Thought you might need someone to keep an eye on things while you're gone." Webb was a man in his 50s, weathered and practical, who'd come west after losing his own farm to drought in Kansas. He'd never shown any particular prejudice against Cherokee people, and his own struggles with economic hardship seemed to have given him sympathy for anyone trying to make an honest living. "Can't pay much," Marcus warned. "Didn't ask for much," Webb replied. "Truth is, I'm between properties right now, staying in town and paying more rent than I can afford. Watching your place would give me somewhere to stay and something useful to do. These kids can teach me things about this land that might help when I find my own place to settle." It was a mutually beneficial arrangement that solved immediate problems for everyone involved. Webb would stay at the farm, keeping the children safe and learning from their knowledge of the land. The children would have adult protection without being separated from their home. Marcus would be free to pursue the legal steps that would make their family official. "There's one more thing," Marcus said as they finalized the arrangement. "If Jeremiah Colt or any of his people come around making trouble, you don't try to handle it alone. You take these children to the creek crossing where the old Cherokee trail runs, and you wait. I left signals there, people who'll know to get word to me if there's real danger." Webb nodded, understanding. "You got friends in the Cherokee community?" "I got family now," Marcus corrected, "and family takes care of family." The morning of departure was harder than Marcus had expected. Over the months since their first meeting, these children had become so integral to his daily existence that leaving them felt like tearing off a piece of himself. Tommy hugged him with desperate intensity, whispering urgent instructions about how to take care of Hope during the journey. Ayanna pressed a small pouch into his hands. "Cherokee traveling medicine," she explained, "herbs to keep him safe on the road." Samuel shook his hand with the gravity of one man seeing another off on. "Important business. You come back to us," Samuel said simply. "Promise you'll come back." "I promise," Marcus replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. As he rode away from the Blackwood farm, heading east toward the territorial capital and whatever bureaucratic battles awaited, Marcus carried with him not just legal documents and traveling supplies, but something far more precious: the absolute certainty that he was riding toward a future worth fighting for. Behind him, 3 Cherokee children and a cornhusk doll waved goodbye from the cabin porch, watching until he disappeared over the horizon. They were Stone Ridge Walker family now, by choice and by love, and no territorial court was going to change that fundamental truth. But getting official recognition for what already existed in their hearts, that was going to require every ounce of determination Marcus Stone possessed. The journey toward legal recognition of their family was about to begin. Marcus had been gone for 8 days when the riders came. Thomas Webb spotted them first, silhouetted against the grey January sky as they crested the hill overlooking the Blackwood farm. 5 men on horseback, moving with the deliberate pace of people who had business to conduct and weren't particularly worried about resistance. "Children," Webb called quietly from where he stood splitting wood near the barn. "Get inside, now." Samuel, who'd been checking the chicken coop, immediately understood the urgency. He herded Ayanna and Tommy toward the cabin with the swift efficiency of someone who'd learned to recognize danger. Tommy clutched Hope tightly, his small face already pale with fear. Through the cabin window, they watched the riders descend the slope. Jeremiah Colt led the group, as imposing as ever in his expensive coat and beaver hat. But the men flanking him were different from his usual business associates, harder men with the lean, predatory look of wolves who'd found an isolated homestead. Webb positioned himself near the cabin door, his rifle within easy reach but not openly displayed. He'd fought in the war between the states and knew the difference between showing strength and provoking violence. These men had come looking for trouble, but he wouldn't give them an excuse to claim self-defense. "Webb!" Colt called out as the riders approached the yard. "Heard you were keeping watch on this place. Neighborly of you." Thomas Webb stepped forward, keeping his voice steady and neutral. "Mr. Colt, what brings you out to the Blackwood place?" Colt dismounted with theatrical casualness, his boots crunching in the packed snow. "Official business, you might say. Got reports of trespassing on this property, unauthorized occupation by parties who might not have legal standing to be here." Inside the cabin, Samuel felt his stomach drop. Somehow, Colt had learned that Marcus was away and the children were vulnerable. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. "Property owners traveling on business," Webb replied carefully. "Left me to keep an eye on things. Everything's been quiet and legal." One of Colt's companions, a thin man with nervous eyes, spoke up. "Ain't talking about you, Webb. Talking about them Cherokee kids been squatting on good farmland. Heard tell they been here for months, probably stealing anything not nailed down." Ayanna pressed closer to the window, her young heart racing. She could see the hatred in the men's faces, the way they sat their horses like hunters who'd cornered their prey. These weren't men who'd come to ask questions. They'd come for violence. "Children are under Mr. Stone's protection," Webb said firmly. Got his word on that, and his word's good as any legal document in this territory. Colt laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Stone's word might carry weight if Stone was here, but he ain't, is he? Left you to babysit 3 Cherokee brats while he goes gallivanting off to the territorial capital." The specific knowledge chilled Webb's blood. Colt knew exactly where Marcus had gone and why. Someone had been watching, listening, reporting back. The children weren't just vulnerable, they'd been deliberately targeted when their protector was away. "Stone left clear instructions," Webb said, his hand moving slightly closer to his rifle. "Any problems, any threats, I'm to handle them as I see fit." "Problems?" Colt's voice carried mock surprise. "Who said anything about problems?" I'm here in my capacity as a concerned citizen, reporting suspected criminal activity to the proper authorities. He gestured toward one of his riders, a man wearing a tarnished badge that might have been official. Deputy Marshal Hackett here has jurisdiction over matters involving Indian trespassing and theft. We're just here to collect evidence. The badge was real enough, though Hackett looked more like a hired gun than a lawman. Webb recognized the type, men who used legal authority as cover for personal vendettas and private profit. Inside the cabin, Tommy began to cry quietly, the sound muffled against Hope's cornhusk hair. Ayanna put her arms around her little brother, while Samuel considered their options. The bird call signals Marcus had taught them wouldn't help. Their nearest Cherokee allies were miles away, and these men would never allow time for rescue to arrive. Evidence of what exactly? Webb asked, though he already knew the answer didn't matter. These men had come to take the children, and they'd manufacture whatever justification they needed. Deputy Marshal Hackett consulted a piece of paper with elaborate ceremony. Reports of livestock theft, destruction of property, and illegal occupation by hostile Indians. Standard procedure is to detain suspects pending full investigation. It was legal-sounding nonsense designed to provide cover for kidnapping. Once the children were in Colt's custody, they could disappear into the territorial system, boarding schools, work farms, or simply the vast emptiness of a country that had never much cared what happened to Cherokee children. You got witnesses to these alleged crimes? Webb demanded. Got all the witnesses I need, Colt replied smoothly, including reliable reports from citizens who've seen suspicious activity on this property for months. The conversation was interrupted by a small voice from the cabin doorway. Tommy had slipped away from his siblings and stood on the threshold. Hope clutched in his arms, his young face streaked with tears, but set with determination. We didn't steal nothing, Tommy said clearly, his voice carrying across the yard. We been taking care of this place, not hurting it. Ask the chickens. They'll tell you we feed them good every day. The sight of the 6-year-old Cherokee boy speaking in his defense seemed to enrage rather than soften the mounted men. Hackett's hand moved toward his gun, while another rider cursed under his breath. Get back inside, son, Webb said urgently. But Tommy didn't move. Hope says you're lying, Tommy continued, addressing Colt directly with the fearless honesty that only children possess. Hope says you're the one hurting the land, not us. Says you got darkness in your heart where love should be. Colt's face flushed with anger. That boy's been listening to heathen superstitions too long. Probably half wild by now, talking to dolls like they're people. He signaled to 2 of his men, who began dismounting. Hackett, arrest those children for trespassing and theft. We'll sort out the details back in town. No. The word came from Samuel, who appeared beside Tommy with Ayanna close behind. All 3 children stood together on the cabin porch, facing 5 armed men with nothing but their courage and their faith in each other. You ain't taking us, Samuel said, his 12-year-old voice carrying an authority that belied his years. This is our home now, legal and proper. Marcus Stone is our guardian, and we got papers being drawn up in the territorial capital to prove it. Papers that don't exist yet don't mean nothing, Hackett sneered, drawing his pistol. And Cherokee, Brat's got no legal standing anyway. You're coming with us, willing or fighting. Webb raised his rifle then, the barrel pointing directly at Hackett's chest. Like hell they are. The yard went silent except for the whisper of wind through bare cottonwood branches. 5 armed men faced 1 farmer and 3 children, but the mathematics of violence weren't as simple as they appeared. Webb was a veteran fighter in a defensive position, and killing him would require explanation to authorities who might actually care about a white farmer's death. You really want to die for 3 Cherokee kids, Webb? Colt asked softly. I want to live for the idea that children deserve protection, Webb replied steadily. But if dying's what it takes, I reckon I can manage that too. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled peacefully, a sound from another world where children were safe and men settled disputes with words instead of weapons. It was Ayanna who broke the tension, stepping forward with something clutched in her small hands. "Wait," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Before anybody starts shooting, you should know something important." She held up a folded piece of paper, its official seal visible even at a distance. "Here's a telegram from the territorial capital. Came through this morning while you were riding out from town." Colt's eyes narrowed. "What kind of telegram?" "The kind that says our adoption papers got approved," Ayanna said with quiet triumph. "Says we're legally the children of Marcus Stone as of yesterday morning. Says any interference with his parental rights is a federal offense, punishable by 5 years in territorial prison." It was a magnificent bluff, delivered with such conviction that even Samuel and Tommy believed it for a moment. There had been no telegram, no early approval, no federal protection. But Ayanna understood that doubt was a weapon too, and she wielded it with surgical precision. Hackett's gun hand wavered slightly. "Let me see that paper." "You can see it from there," Ayanna replied, holding the document higher. "Says right here that Deputy Marshal Hackett of Millfield is specifically warned against any action that might be construed as interference with legally recognized family rights." The paper was actually a receipt for supplies Marcus had purchased weeks earlier, but in the grey winter light, official-looking documents all resembled each other. More importantly, Colt's men weren't close enough to read the details. "That's impossible," Colt snarled, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Those papers would take weeks to process. Would take weeks if you didn't have friends in the territorial government," Samuel added, picking up his sister's deception with quick intelligence. "But Marcus Stone knows people, important people, people who don't like seeing Cherokee children mistreated." Tommy nodded solemnly, hugging Hope tighter. "Hope says the paper's got magic writing on it that protects families. Says anyone who hurts us now will get in big trouble with the law." The combination of official documentation and childish innocence was devastatingly effective. These men had come prepared to bully defenseless children, not to explain their actions to federal authorities who might have actual power to punish them. Colt remounted his horse with visible frustration, his jaw working as he calculated risks and benefits. "This ain't over," he said finally. "When Stone gets back, you tell him he's made some powerful enemies. Tell him Cherokee loving won't be tolerated in this territory much longer." "I'll tell him you stopped by," Webb replied evenly, his rifle still trained on the group. "I'll also tell him you threatened his legally adopted children on his own property. Pretty sure he'll find that real interesting." The riders wheeled their horses and departed with considerably less ceremony than they'd arrived, leaving behind only hoofprints in the snow and the acrid smell of fear and frustrated violence. As soon as they disappeared over the hill, Ayanna collapsed onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The fake telegram fluttered from her nerveless fingers, revealing itself as nothing more than a grocery receipt, with official-looking printing. "Sweet Jesus, girl," Webb breathed, lowering his rifle with shaking hands. "That was the bravest thing I ever saw, and the craziest." Samuel sank down beside his sister, reaction setting in now that the danger had passed. "You think they believed it?" "Believed it enough," Ayanna whispered. "Believed it enough to leave us alone for now." Tommy sat between his siblings, still clutching Hope, his young face grave with understanding beyond his years. "Hope says they'll be back. Says angry men don't stay fooled very long." He was right, of course. Colt's retreat was tactical, not permanent. Once he verified that no telegram had actually arrived, once he confirmed that the adoption papers weren't yet official, he'd return with greater force and fewer scruples about witnesses. "We need to get word to Marcus," Webb said, scanning the horizon for signs of returning riders. "Need to let him know what's happening here." But even as he spoke, they all knew the harsh mathematics of their situation. Marcus was days away at the territorial capital, fighting bureaucratic battles that might take weeks to resolve. Colt was hours away in Millfield, planning their next move with the resources of wealth and local prejudice behind him. The children had won this confrontation through courage and quick thinking, but the war for their freedom was far from over. And the next battle might not be won with clever bluffs and borrowed time. As the winter afternoon faded toward evening, the Blackwood farm settled into an uneasy quiet. But beneath the peaceful surface, preparations were already beginning for whatever violence tomorrow might bring. The cursed land that had known so much sorrow was about to witness whether love and family could triumph over hatred and greed. The answer would depend on the courage of 3 Cherokee children, one determined farmer, and a silent cowboy who was fighting his own battles hundreds of miles away. Marcus Stone rode through the pre-dawn darkness like a man chased by demons, his horse's hooves drumming against the frozen ground in rhythm with his racing heart. The telegram had reached him at the territorial capital just as the adoption papers were being finalized, a desperate message from Thomas Webb that chilled his blood. Colt came with men. Children safe for now. Hurry. For 2 days and nights, he'd pushed himself and Crow to the edge of endurance, stopping only to rest the horse and grab a few hours of sleep. The official documents proclaiming Samuel, Ayanna, and Tommy as his legally adopted children were folded in his coat pocket, but paper meant nothing if he arrived too late to protect the family those papers represented. The eastern sky was just beginning to show pale grey when Marcus crested the hill overlooking Blackwood Farm. What he saw below made him draw rein so sharply that Crow danced sideways in protest. The farmyard swarmed with men and horses. Not the 5 riders Webb had described, but at least a dozen, positioned around the cabin like hunters surrounding cornered prey. Smoke rose from multiple campfires, suggesting they'd been there for hours, waiting for dawn to begin whatever violence they'd planned. Jeremiah Colt stood near the cabin door, with Deputy Marshal Hackett at his side, both men armed and clearly in command. The other riders were spread in a loose circle, their rifles ready, their faces hard with the anticipation of men about to settle old scores. Through the cabin window, Marcus could see movement, shadows against lamplight that told him his family was still alive, still free, still fighting. But they were trapped, outnumbered 12-1, with nowhere to run and no way to call for help. Marcus studied the scene with the tactical eye of a man who'd survived too many dangerous situations to let emotion override strategy. Direct assault was suicide. Even if he managed to kill 2 or 3 of Colt's men, the others would cut him down before he reached the cabin. But the alternative was watching from the hillside while his children were dragged away to disappear forever into the territorial system. That wasn't an alternative at all. He was still considering his options when the cabin door opened and Thomas Webb emerged, his hands raised but his back straight with uncompromising dignity. Behind him came the children, Samuel with his jaw set in grim determination, Ayanna holding Tommy's hand while the little boy clutched hope to his chest. "Well now," Colt called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold morning air. "Looks like our Cherokee friends finally decided to be reasonable." Webb's voice was steady despite the guns trained on him. "They decided not to let you burn down the cabin with them inside. That's different than being reasonable." Marcus felt his heart stop. They'd threatened to burn his family alive to force their surrender. The depth of Colt's hatred was even greater than he'd imagined. "Smart choice," Hackett sneered. "Save us the trouble of smoking you out like vermin." Samuel stepped forward, his 12-year-old voice carrying across the yard with surprising authority. "You got what you came for. Let Mr. Webb go. He ain't done nothing but try to protect children." Mr. Webb interfered with a lawful arrest, Colt replied smoothly. That makes him an accessory to Indian trespassing and theft. He'll be coming with us too. It was then that Tommy spoke up, his small voice cutting through the morning air like a knife. You're making the land sad again, he said clearly, addressing Colt directly. Hope says the ground doesn't want angry people on it anymore. Says if you don't leave, something bad's gonna happen. The men laughed at a 6-year-old's threat delivered through a cornhusk doll, but their laughter had an edge of nervousness. There was something about the child's absolute conviction that unsettled even hardened men. Only bad thing happening. Here is Cherokee brats learning their place, one of the riders called out. That was when Marcus made his decision. He guided Crow down the hillside at a steady walk, making no attempt at stealth or surprise. Better to announce his presence than be shot as a sneak attacker trying to ambush 12 armed men. The sound of hoofbeats brought every head around. Colt's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, anger, and something that might have been genuine fear as he recognized the silent cowboy riding toward them with deliberate calm. "Marcus!" Tommy's cry of joy pierced the morning air, but Samuel quickly shushed his little brother, understanding that premature celebration might trigger the violence everyone was trying to avoid. Marcus rode directly into the center of the yard, dismounting 20 feet from where Colt stood. His movements were unhurried, economical, giving no indication of hostile intent, even as his eyes catalogued the position of every armed man. "Colt," he said quietly, his first word since arriving carrying more weight than a shouted challenge. "Heard you've been keeping my children company." "Your children?" Colt's voice dripped with mock surprise. "Funny thing about that, Stone. Checked with the territorial office yesterday. No adoption papers on file, no legal guardianship. Nothing but a white man playing house with Cherokee strays." Marcus reached slowly into his coat pocket, his movements deliberately visible to avoid triggering nervous fingers on rifle triggers. He withdrew the official documents and held them up for all to see. "Filed yesterday morning," he said simply. "Samuel, Ayanna, and Thomas Stone Ridgewalker, legally adopted children under territorial law. Any interference with my parental rights is a federal offense." The papers were real this time, bearing official seals and signatures that couldn't be dismissed as clever forgeries. Colt's face darkened as he realized his legal justification had just evaporated. "Papers or no papers," he snarled, "Cherokee blood don't belong on good farmland. This territory's got rules about who counts as citizens and who don't." "My children are citizens," Marcus replied calmly. "Says so right here in black and white. Signed by Territorial Judge William Morrison, witnessed by Federal Marshal James Crawford." Hackett shifted uneasily, recognizing names that carried real authority. These weren't local officials who could be bought or intimidated. These were federal appointees who answered directly to Washington. "Doesn't matter," Colt said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Adoption papers don't change the fact that these children have been living as squatters on property they had no right to occupy." "They had my right," Marcus said, his quiet voice somehow more threatening than any shout could have been. "They've had my permission to live here from the day I met them. That makes them guests, not trespassers." One of Colt's riders, clearly growing nervous about the legal complications, spoke up. "Boss, maybe you should shut up and let me handle this," Colt snapped, but Marcus could see doubt spreading through the group. What had started as a simple case of intimidating defenseless children had become a complex legal situation with potential federal consequences. It was then that Ayanna stepped forward, her young voice clear and strong. "Mr. Colt, you keep talking about Cherokee people like we're not real citizens, like we don't have rights. But we do now. We got papers that say so, and we got a father who'll fight for us." She looked directly at Marcus, her dark eyes shining with trust and love. "And we got something else you don't understand. We got land that wants to heal, and we know how to help it heal." Tommy nodded solemnly, holding up hope. Hope says the ground's been waiting for people who understand how to love it. Says that's why nothing grew right for the white farmers. They were trying to force it instead of asking it. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the farmyard and illuminating the faces of 12 armed men who'd come to terrorize children, but found themselves listening to a 6-year-old's wisdom about agriculture and love. "This is ridiculous," Colt declared, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I didn't come here to listen to Cherokee superstition and Indian mysticism." "No," Marcus said, his hand moving slightly closer to his gun. "You came here to terrorize children. You came here to threaten my family. Question is, what are you planning to do now?" The confrontation had reached its critical moment. Colt had the numbers, but Marcus had the law, the moral high ground, and something else that couldn't be quantified, the absolute determination of a man protecting his family. Samuel stepped up beside Marcus, his young shoulders squared with courage beyond his years. "We ain't afraid of you anymore, Mr. Colt. We got each other, and we got the law, and we got land that's ready to bloom again." Ayanna joined them, her small hand finding Marcus's arm. "The cursed ground ain't cursed anymore. It's blessed now, blessed with family and love, and people who understand what it needs." Tommy completed the line, walking solemnly to stand with his family while Hope watched from the safety of his arms. "Hope says you can't hurt us anymore. Says love is stronger than hate, and we got more love than you got hate." 4 people, a silent cowboy, a Cherokee boy becoming a man, a wise little girl, and a 6-year-old with a corn husk doll, stood together in the morning sunlight, facing 12 armed men with nothing but courage and an unshakable faith in each other. The standoff stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, unexpectedly, one of Colt's riders holstered his weapon and turned his horse away. "I ain't shooting children with legal adoption papers," he said quietly. "This ain't what I signed up for." Another rider followed, then another. Within moments, half of Colt's force had melted away, leaving him with 6 men instead of 12, and those remaining looked increasingly uncomfortable with their position. "You're all making a mistake," Colt called after the departing riders, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a man who'd lost control of his own operation. Marcus took a step forward, his presence somehow filling more space than his physical size should have allowed. "Mistake would be staying here any longer. You've got no legal standing, no moral justification, and no support from your own men. Time to leave." Hackett's hand hovered near his gun, but he was calculating odds that looked increasingly unfavorable. A corrupt deputy marshal could explain. Shooting squatters and trespassers, but murdering legally adopted children in front of witnesses was another matter entirely. "This ain't over, Stone," Colt said through gritted teeth, but he was already backing toward his horse. "Cherokee lovers ain't welcome in this territory. We got ways of making that clear." "You're welcome to try," Marcus replied calmly. "But next time you threaten my family, understand that I'll be ready for you." The remaining riders mounted and departed with considerably less ceremony than they'd arrived, leaving behind only hoofprints in the snow and the acrid smell of frustrated violence. As soon as the last horseman disappeared over the hill, Tommy broke free from the solemn group and ran to Marcus, throwing his arms around the cowboy's legs while Hope got squeezed between them. "You came back!" Tommy cried, his small voice muffled against Marcus's coat. "Hope said you would, but I was scared anyway." Ayanna and Samuel approached more slowly, but their relief was just as profound. Marcus found himself with an armful of Cherokee children, all talking at once, all needing reassurance that their family was truly safe and truly together. Thomas Webb holstered his rifle with a long sigh of relief. "Thought for sure we were going to have a shooting war," he said quietly. "Those adoption papers came just in time." "Wouldn't have mattered if they hadn't been brave enough to stand up for themselves," Marcus replied, looking down at the 3. Children who'd faced down armed men with nothing but courage and hope. They saved themselves as much as I did. Over the following days, as the immediate crisis faded into memory, the Stone Ridgewalker family began planning for the future they'd fought so hard to secure. The adoption papers were filed with the county Lark, making their legal status unassailable. Thomas Webb decided to stay through spring planting, drawn by the children's promise to teach him Cherokee farming methods that might succeed where traditional approaches had failed. But the most significant change came in the land itself. As winter gradually gave way to spring, the cursed earth of Blackwood Farm began to show signs of genuine healing. The geometric crack patterns that had marked the soil's distress gradually filled in, replaced by the rich, loamy texture of ground, ready to support new growth. Tommy, with Hope's guidance, planted the first seeds, traditional Cherokee corn varieties that his grandmother had carried from the old country. Samuel and Ayanna prepared the soil, using techniques passed down through generations, methods that worked with the land's natural rhythms rather than against them. Marcus provided the practical knowledge of frontier farming, the tools and equipment needed to turn Cherokee wisdom into productive agriculture. But more importantly, he provided the legal protection and physical security that allowed his family to work without fear. By late spring, when the first green shoots pushed through the formerly barren earth, visitors came from miles around to witness the miracle of Blackwood Farm. Cherokee families brought seeds and knowledge, sharing varieties of crops that had been grown on this land for centuries before the white settlers arrived. White farmers came too, curious about techniques that could make cursed ground bloom. Some came with prejudice and skepticism, but most left with new understanding about the value of working with the land rather than attempting to dominate it. The secret, Ayanna explained to a group of visitors one warm May afternoon, ain't making the ground do what you want. It's listening to what the ground wants to do, then helping it do that. Tommy, now 7 and still carrying hope everywhere, added his own wisdom. Hope says the earth just wanted people to love it again. Once it knew we loved it, it started loving us back. The corn grew tall that summer, taller than anyone remembered seeing on Blackwood Farm. The Cherokee varieties Samuel had planted proved perfectly suited to the soil and climate, producing yields that amazed experienced farmers from across the territory. But the real harvest was measured in something beyond bushels and profits. The Stone Ridgewalker family had not just healed cursed land. They'd created a model for how different peoples could work together, how love could triumph over hatred, how broken things could be made whole again. Marcus stood in the doorway of the cabin one evening in late summer, watching his children play in the yard, while Thomas Webb taught Samuel advanced techniques for reading weather signs in the clouds. The scene was so perfectly ordinary, so beautifully normal, that it took his breath away. Ayanna appeared at his elbow with the silent grace that seemed natural to her. "What you thinking about?" she asked quietly. "Thinking about how quiet it used to be," Marcus replied. "How empty. Thinking about how much better everything is with family to fill it up." She smiled and leaned against his arm, comfortable in the casual affection that had grown between them over the months. Grandmama used to say the heart's like farmland. It needs love and attention to grow anything good, but once it starts growing, it can feed a whole family. That night, as they gathered around the table for their evening meal, Marcus looked at each face in the lamplight and felt a contentment he'd never thought possible. Samuel, growing into young manhood with the quiet strength that would make him a leader in any community. Ayanna, whose wisdom seemed to grow deeper with each passing season. Tommy, still innocent enough to believe in cornhusk dolls and magic, still wise enough to see truth that adults often missed. Thomas Webb, who'd become more than a hired hand. He'd become part of their extended family, an uncle whose presence enriched all their lives. This was what he'd been searching for without knowing it during all those years of solitude and silence. Not just survival, Not even just success, but connection, the deep, abiding knowledge that he mattered to other people, and they mattered to him. The cursed ground of Blackwood Farm had become blessed ground, not through prayer or ceremony, but through the simple act of people choosing to love each other despite all the forces that tried to keep them apart. Outside, the summer crickets sang their ancient songs, and the corn rustled in the gentle evening breeze. Inside the cabin, a family born of choice rather than blood-shared stories and laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of another day, lived together. Jeremiah Colt had never returned to make good on his threats. Some said he'd been ruined by bad investments and had left the territory entirely. Others claimed he'd simply realized that some battles couldn't be won through force or intimidation. Marcus suspected the truth was simpler. Hatred was exhausting to maintain, especially when it produced nothing but failure and isolation. Love, on the other hand, seemed to grow stronger with each passing season, producing harvests that fed not just bodies, but souls. As the family prepared for bed, Tommy made his nightly announcement about Hope's wisdom. Hope says tomorrow's gonna be another good day. Says the ground's happy, the chickens are happy, and we're all gonna be happy too. Hope's pretty smart, Marcus replied, as he did every night. Hope says you're smart too, Tommy responded with a giggle. Says you figured out the most important thing of all. What's that? Tommy's face grew serious with the gravity he brought to all matters involving his doll. That family ain't about blood or papers or anything like that. It's about choosing to love people and keep on loving them no matter what. Marcus tucked the adoption papers into Catherine's old Bible that night, adding them to the record of births and deaths, loves and losses that documented the continuing story of family. The Stones and the Ridgewalkers were now permanently joined in the official record, but more importantly, they were joined in the daily reality of shared hopes and common purpose. The last thing Marcus saw before sleep claimed him was moonlight, streaming through the cabin window, illuminating the peaceful faces of 3 Cherokee children who'd taught a silent cowboy how to speak the language of love. The cursed land had been healed. The broken family had been made whole. And in the heart of Oklahoma Territory, 4 people who'd found each other against impossible odds were building something that would endure long after the last of the corn had been harvested. They were building home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.